Well, we are live again with another History and Politics. And we're staying in keeping with the current politics, aligning with the historical framework. And right now, the White House, upon the most recent visit of the South African president, our president, Donald Trump, um, felt the need to point out to the South African president how horrified he is at the activity that's going on in South Africa, where, as he put it, Black South Africans are committing a genocide against white South Africans. Now, whether that's true is not necessarily so, but it did get me to thinking about some other things currently the administration is doing, which builds us deeper into this political framework, which is the Reformation on United States history. And of course, without going deeper into it, you say, oh, they're upset about um, education, about slavery that makes whites feel bad, which is what they're articulating. And as a historian, what I have learned is generally what is articulated, what is being articulated, is truly not the core of the concerns politically in this country. And I just started doing a thought experiment and I said, well, we have this South Africa issue and we have this education issue. And just so happened, I had been reading I finished the autobiography of Malcolm X, I finished the autobiography of Mahatma Gandhi, and I am in the middle of the autobiography of Nelson Mandela. And I'm seeing how the European did the same thing. White supremacy has the same framework no matter where it is, which lets us know what happened and happens, what happened and what is happening in the United States is no accident. And the people who think it's an accident see there are only two outcomes of that. It's that they know, and it's through cognitive dissonance or their personal agendas as to why they don't acknowledge what's going on, or they truly don't know because we don't teach it. And I start thinking a little further. Perhaps our education is not primarily meant to keep minorities dumb, which is an example. We don't teach any Native American history. And what is considered civilized, what is considered educated, what is considered moral is the European framework. So if you are considered an educated person, you're learning history from the point Americans or Europeans got to the West, if we're talking about the United States. So the history of Mexicans pre-Western expansion, we don't teach that. The history of Native, the culture, and ethnicities, and that's not part of history. history of Native Americans. Black people are represented from slavery forward. Not, okay, let's say at a time, the European structure that put together our curriculum for public education actually didn't know about Mansa Musa and all of the kings and pharaohs of Egypt and the economic systems and the trade systems of Africa. Maybe they didn't know at a time. We know now in 2025, and guess what? We're still not teaching it. Why are Black people's history taught from slavery forward? Like your beginning is always slavery. When we know the civilization that this people came from, we know all these different things, and it's not being taught anymore. So, what reading those 3 books taught me was the same thing was going on at the same time on three different continents. The making what is European superior and what is indigenous inferior. That happened in India. They had travel laws. They couldn't own land. They had to be considered educated. They had to let go of their history and learn the history of the European. They had to learn the language of the European. They had to learn the laws of the European. Everything that happened there happened here. So these were articulated systems that were in no way an accident. This is something being replicated around the globe, and it needed to be protected so it could be replicated. And once it went along long enough, the victims of it had begun to think that this was right, that the British were our benefactors as opposed to the people who came and took our land. Now, one thing that is quite unique is in North America, that is the only place where white supremacy occurred on the globe, where the entire indigenous foundation was killed and replaced. In South Africa, the South Africans are still there, and they are still there. They're having some trouble with them now, which is what brought up this thinking. The Indian population is still there from India. They're still there. The Mexican, the Caribbean, all of those people are still there. It is only the native and native African people of North America that were wiped out. Now, the Native African people just got pushed into slavery, but the Native Americans that were not of African descent and of African genealogy were completely replaced, whereas the white power structure or the white supremacist government claimed the land to be their own with no opposition. So unlike in South Africa, there is a natural pushback of you don't belong here because we're indigenous. That was absent here. So America is a very unique place just by the genocide of the Native American that did not occur anywhere else in white supremacist lore. So when we begin to research or learn about white supremacy, we have to stop looking at it in the microcosm of a nation or even a continent. We have to connect it globally to get a full understanding of the mindset and coordination of how this was done, to fully understand that this is being done in concert. This is not something that's unfolding just as time goes. This is how it worked out. The same thing is happening on the other side of the country. And then on the other side of the world, I mean. And then on the other side of that, it's happening there. And to say that this was not coordinated, has anybody heard of the Berlin Conference? Of course it's coordinated. Now, as I was pondering that, I started looking at that's why they don't want to teach American history in depth. They don't want the systems to be understood because the systems are ultimately about wealth. That's all race is. They took over India not because they disliked the Indians. They took their resources and wanted to make sure they had exclusive access to the resources. That's why they couldn't travel easily. That's why they couldn't own land. That's why they couldn't have certain jobs. That's why they couldn't get educated. And they did the same thing in Africa. They did the same thing here. They did the same thing in South America. They did the same thing in the Caribbean. It was all over resources. So now, who is the biggest group of poor people? Poor whites. That's who this education is being withheld from. Because when poor whites get upset, you're going to have a civil war. Black folks are going to march. Native Americans are going to go to the courts. Historically, that's what happened. The 5 civilized tribes went all the way to the Supreme Court, won. Andrew Jackson just ignored it, took their stuff anyway. Black folks marched. We all know that. Sing. Met with violence. Everybody seen Selma on the bridge. But we ignore all of the lynchings and the police with the water hoses and the police with the dogs and police with the billy clubs and all the people getting arrested for civil resistance. We ignore all of that and we call Black people violent because that's what we want to teach. But all of that is to keep the poor whites at bay. And if you don't believe that, it was actually articulated in communication with Great Britain the first time there was an uprising of poor white people. It was called Bacon's Rebellion, 1676. Poor whites rebelled against the ruling class for a year. So when we hear about these reformations on education and it's jumping on the Black Smithsonian, that's for a reason. When you start touching race, you begin to touch money. When you begin to touch money, you start to touch class. And as much as white people are a little fuzzy on race, historically speaking, they're not historically oblivious to poverty. And poverty makes them angry.